Okay, I want to welcome everybody to Decisions on the Edge, Designing Education Programs for Streamside Landowners. This is our second in our series, Research to Practice, Addressing Non-Point Source Pollution. In this series, we've been discussing current non-point source pollution research and the practical or practice implications for watershed professionals. Funding for this webinar series has been provided through a grant from the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency. I'm Baird. I'm with Ohio State University Extension in the School of Environment and Natural Resources. I'll be the host for today and also one of the presenters. I just wanted to let you know our next webinar in this NPS series will take place on Thursday, January 27th, also at noon. We want to thank everybody for joining us on your lunch hour. Brian will be posting the link for how to register for that one. Throughout the webinar today, you can post questions or comments you have anytime in the chat box on the lower right-hand side of your screen. I'd first like to introduce our presenters today. All our presenters and our moderator are with the Ohio State University in the School of Environment and Natural Resources here on the Columbus campus. Our first presenter will be Robyn Wilson. Robyn is an assistant professor in environmental and decision science and risk analysis. Our second presenter today is Deborah Hersha. Deb is a postdoctoral researcher working with Robyn. Our moderator today is Joe Bonnell, who'll be helping us with the discussion portion of this hour, which will be about the last 15 to 20 minutes. Joe is a program director in watershed management with Ohio State University Extension, also in the school. Brian Weaver will be helping us with the technical aspects of the presentation. You can email Brian anytime or just send him a message in the chat if something's not working. With that, I think I'll go ahead and turn it over to Robyn.
Great. Thanks, Ann. As soon as I get control of the here. There we go. All right. So what I'm going to do today is just start off and kind of introduce big picture what we're hoping to cover and share with you during the webinar. Specifically, I'll be addressing the research design overview as the first piece here, and so giving you a little bit of background on the project that we'll be telling you about today, and specifically trying to save more time to focus on the results of this project, but try to give you some background and some grounding and the motivation for this and the structure of what we worked on. What then I'll also do is I'll talk a little bit about major decision influences. So part of this project was looking at knowledge among community members from teenagers, high school students, up to a wide range of adults, looking at the knowledge they have about stream health and then also the sorts of things that might be influencing their decisions relevant to stream health, so things that they could be doing to engage in protection for streams. And so what I'll do is I'll give a broad overview of some of the major decision influences and the things that people talked about, what they knew, what they didn't know, across this broad group of, again, 18 to probably 80-year-olds living in the central Ohio area. And so what I'll do is I'll explain briefly two kind of aspects of the project, an expert model we put together related to decisions about stream health, and then also talk a little bit about the target audience mental models, and so the sorts of things that people talked about related to this issue. But then I'll hand it over to Ann and to Deb, and they'll talk more specifically about the audience, but broken down into these components of kind of the adults and current landowners, and then the youth or the future landowners, and they'll key in on some of the really specific things that I think will help you think about outreach and education relevant to these audiences. So again, I'll be covering these first kind of pieces to give you some background and give you a big picture of what was going on. The project that we're presenting today and we're sharing with you was funded by the USDA National Integrated Water Quality Program, so this is a project through that program. Specifically, what we proposed doing was using what's called a mental models methodology among these target audiences in two central Ohio watersheds. And the goal of the methodology really is to just inform the design of risk communication efforts. So the methodology was developed because sometimes we assume that as a group of experts or a group of kind of knowledgeable individuals that we have information that people need to make better choices, specifically choices relevant to risk. And so what we do is we communicate with them what what we think they need to know. And so the methodology was developed to basically say, well, there might be things that we need to know as the quote-unquote expert or knowledgeable audience, but we can't just assume that that's what people need to know in order to make better choices. So we need to put some effort into seeing where people are at, what their perspective is, the sorts of things they think about, which can then help us focus our communication efforts in a more targeted way, focusing on gaps in knowledge, focusing on major misperceptions people might have relevant to that risk, framing our communication efforts in light of things that are very salient to people, things that are influencing people's decisions. So the methodology creates this kind of two-way process of communication between those trying to communicate with a particular audience and the audience, allowing them to communicate with the experts or those that are developing these efforts. And so the methodology has 5 steps, and the 2 that we're presenting today are the expert and the audience mental models. And so specifically we start with this kind of expert conception of the risk, things that people need to know, the decision process, and then we use and we do that through literature review and also interviews with experts. But then we go to our target audience and we ask them questions in a very kind of open-ended interview structure aimed at developing a model we can compare that we call the mental model back to the expert model. So you have these 2 conceptions of the risk and of the decision, and you can compare them and look for similarities and differences. So again, this targets or kind of highlights the things that your target audience might need to know, things that the experts thought were important that maybe the target audience didn't understand or didn't talk about, but also highlights things in reverse. So it highlights things that the audience is thinking about that maybe experts need to consider in order to be more effective in their communication. So some of the big questions that we are focusing on guiding this research from a big picture were, what do citizens, specifically rural to urban citizens, know about water quality and stream health, and what are the major influences on their stream stewardship decisions? So broadly speaking, those were the big questions that we had. So what we did is we conducted, again, in-depth interviews with about 45 Central Ohio citizens, ages 16 to 80. So approximately half of that group were high school students, and then a small set of interviews with some of their parents, focusing more on what we would call the future streamside landowners. And then about half of that group were current community members, and that's the piece that Ann will talk about a little bit more. So a strictly adult audience, many who own land on streams and are thinking about these things pretty actively. So in those interviews, we probed knowledge about streams, about watersheds and how they function, about water quality and what makes water clean, what makes a stream healthy. And we also then, on the other side, probed influences on stream-related decisions. So what sorts of things are really influential on people when they're making decisions related to the stream? We are currently using these findings, one, to design a follow-up survey that will administer more broadly across the watersheds to kind of confirm and to test out some additional hypotheses that we have, confirm some of our current findings and test additional hypotheses. But with the results of these interviews, we are using those results to go ahead and design high school science curriculum that targets some of these gaps in knowledge and misperceptions, and also to use this initial information to develop community-based education and outreach programs that hopefully will be more effective. So what you see here is just the expert model. So this is the big kind of picture overview in terms of the things that experts were thinking about, what they thought was important in terms of streamside landowner and citizen decision-making. So you can see here at the bottom, here's the box that represents the decision. So the sorts of things that people could be doing to protect streams, from very active management on lands, privately owned lands, to kind of voluntary action, writing letters, working with a watershed organization. So a wide range of actions and potential decisions. What experts talked about and what the literature also talked about were some of these things that feed into that final decision. So there's a knowledge component where people need to understand the ecology and how the stream functions. There's a kind of corresponding understanding of threats and impacts. So what threatens the health of the streams, what impacts might result from that. An understanding of these things should be informing our law, policy, and outreach efforts. I'm not going to talk much about these because this was much more relevant and specific to the adult audience that Ann will be talking about. So she'll address this when she jumps in. But what I'll do here forward is kind of talk about everything else you see up here broadly. So some of the key findings across the entire 45 individuals. An understanding of ecological knowledge and threats and impacts, informing law, policy, and outreach should then impact the quality of information gathering and processing. So the degree to which people go out and try to find out information about streams and related risks the extent to which they use this information very carefully in their decision making. Other factors influencing the quality of that information gathering and processing were sociocultural sorts of factors, individual differences, so values and attitudes, and socio-demographic sorts of factors. And then the idea behind this kind of conception of the decision-making process was that depending on the degree to which someone seeks out information and uses that carefully in their decisions will then impact the internalization of the threat. So it'll impact the degree to which that person thinks there's a problem or an issue. And then the thought was that the degree to which they see a threat or think of it as an issue is the kind of final motivating piece that motivates you to go out and take action and to maybe take positive action towards streams. Two other pieces experts talked about, and I'll touch on these briefly, were the idea of barriers, both things that would prevent you from recognizing the threat or internalizing the threat, so the pre-internalization barriers, and then also what we call post-internalization. So for people who have recognized the threat but failed to take action, what's preventing them from taking action? So again, our interviews then, and there's a lot more detail behind these notes, but this is a simplified version. Our interviews were focused on just asking our target audience about these different boxes that you see up here. What do you know about streams? What threats are out there? What influences the degree to which you go out and find information? What influences your perceptions of that risk? What influences your decisions? So we ask kind of broad questions along those lines. So what I'll do is I'll just cover three kind of broad areas, and again, these are some of the big findings that were common across all 45 participants, and then Ann and Deb will go into more detail on some specifics that I think you'll find useful as well. When we look at the influence of knowledge on decision making, there were a few big ecological knowledge gaps worth highlighting. Fairly low understanding of what we would call specialized function. People in general didn't have the best understanding of the role of wetlands, of floodplains, and understanding that these were kind of beneficial and necessary for stream health. Some, of course, did understand that, but on a whole, that was poorly understood. There was a gap in terms of how streams are formed, what direction they flow, the connections across a watershed from land to water, the role of topography in the way streams are formed in the flow. One example is that people sometimes thought stream systems flowed in reverse. So instead of going from small to big, you had big to small, so big rivers to smaller tributaries. And that's important because you don't understand the upstream-downstream connections if you don't know what direction it's going. There was also a gap related to what makes streams healthy, so flow, how fast a stream should be flowing to be healthy was a gap. They often thought a fast-flowing stream was healthy because it was flushing itself out. Also, what the substrate should be, and we think maybe what they see is not necessarily always the healthiest state in terms of the bottom of the stream, but they assume that that's correct or that's what it should be. So some confusion over what even a healthy stream would look like. In terms of threats and impacts, there were some gaps there. In general, people could talk about broad things like pollution and whatnot, but they didn't understand some more of the very specific threats and impacts and kind of the cause of those, where those impacts are coming from. Didn't always understand this issue of channelization and the fact that streams should meander and shouldn't be very straight. Didn't often understand, we don't think, this idea of ecosystem services, the fact that a healthy stream does provide benefits to humans, and that we're getting clean drinking water from streams, we're getting lots of other services from those. And just general, the human influence, I think, was poorly understood, that not all of those connections were being made. And so when we looked broadly across some of these findings, a few of the recommendations we have at this point early on in the process is we need to communicate change over time, because people are focusing a lot on the present state, and they don't have an understanding of what streams used to look like or what they should look like, so they can't even recognize that there's an issue given their kind of short time frame in which they think about streams and the changing structure and function of those streams. Related to that, we need to communicate how healthy streams operate. So structurally, what they should look like, what should be there. Functionally, how they should be operating. Again, people had very limited kind of superficial knowledge of those things, but not very deep kind of understanding of that. We need to better communicate the threats or the causes, the sources. There's three different ways to think about the same thing. People could often identify an impact, but not a threat. And so linking these things would be important too, so they know what's causing issues, because you can't fix an issue unless you know the cause of it. And then finally, communicate the influence of human activity. So influence that humans are having on stream health isn't always well understood, and also the importance of specialized functions, so the importance of wetlands and floodplains, of headwater streams, and why keeping those clean and healthy is important. Those sorts of things we think could have a bigger impact on people recognizing an issue and also being motivated to address it. The next part I want to talk about are just influences on decision making. And so we had a lot here, but some of the key findings, what was really driving the degree to which people sought out information or were motivated to find out information about stream health and actions they could take were an environmental ethics, so a kind of positive environmental value or environmental attitude, and also a perception that recreational opportunities were changing. People really saw that as a big benefit of streams, and if they felt like they were losing that, that could be a motivating factor. In terms of what drove their internalization or their perceptions of that risk or awareness of the risk, they reported that it was largely just an awareness of the problem, so again, recognizing there was an issue to begin with, and they thought this was due partially to information being readily available, and also personal interest in the issue. So again, you have these personal factors coming into play. And of course, then what makes them kind of internalize the threat is ultimately this perception of risk and benefit. So the risks associated with degraded streams, the benefits of a healthy stream, and also adaptive capacity or their ability to kind of do something about it. And so from these, some of the recommendations we had were that we need to ease the path to information. There was some frustration with knowing where to get information or who was ultimately responsible or could help them get the information they needed. We need to frame this information in light of personal interests. So people talked about health concerns, property concerns, recreational concerns, and if we frame information in light of that, we think we can increase the salience of the issue and the importance of the issue to people, and include tips for recognizing problems. So again, if they can't look at a stream and recognize that it's not functioning properly or that there's some sort of issue health-wise, then there's no motivation, no reason to think about it again or to do anything about it. Given the importance of this ethic of environmental stewardship, that we should be working to build that among the communities we're working with, because that seems to be a big motivator. And then also this issue of recreation. So not only using recreational opportunities to communicate with people and educate people, but continue to promote that as a benefit and a service that's provided, because again, it seems to be a big motivation. The last thing I want to cover before I hand it off to Ann are these barriers to action. So when we think about influences on decision making, what are some of these barriers? The biggest thing that people identified in terms of a pre-internalization barrier, so something that would prevent you from becoming concerned, was what we've been calling benign neglect, or just a lack of concern due to being unaware. So not this idea that people don't care or they don't want clean streams, but they don't even know there's an issue, and it's because they just haven't heard about it, they haven't thought about it, it's not a priority. So making this a priority, making this more obvious to people could help remove some of those barriers. The biggest post-internalization barrier, which might have been expected, are economic interests. So even for those people who really want to do something, there's still often a concern about the high personal cost of action, if you're a streamside landowner in particular. This idea of greeds on a corporate or industrial level, that's preventing people from taking appropriate action, so kind of external sorts of factors. But citizens were very interested in monitoring and management. So in terms of the sorts of decisions they talked about, they felt like they could play a role not only in kind of monitoring what's going on and alerting people if there's a problem, but also actively managing some of those issues if they had the ability to do that. And so our recommendations related to this barriers piece were to communicate about problems that currently exist, because we think people don't even know how to recognize those. Increase motivation by focusing on the salient risks and benefits. So people talked a lot about water quality, access and use, human health, aesthetics. And so if these are things that people care about and that motivate them, then we should focus on these issues being at risk or being affected. Also, maybe focus more on actions that aren't limited by economics. Clearly, this will be a barrier in some places, but focus on those things people could be doing that may not be as hindered by that. And finally, people often said, just tell me what needs to be done and how to do it. So again, this kind of lack of information about what we can do to protect streams and how we can go about achieving that. And if people had a better sense of that, we think there might be some higher motivation, or at least the potential for greater adoption of these actions. So that's about all I have from the big picture. I want to give Ann and Deb plenty of time to cover the aspects that are more specific to those two groups. So I'll hand it over to Ann. I think I can switch the presenter ball myself.
Okay, thanks, Robyn. While she's taking care of that, you can send a question to Robyn at any time in the chat box, and Joe Bonnell is going to be keeping track of those, and we'll leave about 15 to 20 minutes at the end to answer any questions. Just a quick background on where this study that Robyn and I and Deb worked on. This was in two rapidly urbanizing watersheds in central Ohio and sort of the northeast portion, the Blacklick and Rocky Fork. And my contribution to the research was to interview streamside landowners in those two watersheds and what we considered critical areas, those areas where were listed as either impaired or threatened. And I spoke with with agricultural landowners, rural landowners, more, as I described it, rural residential, and then also suburban landowners. And what I did with this first slide is I just wanted to create a profile of all those landowners together, if I could, and just to give you a picture of some of the things that they talked to me about, some stories they shared about their experiences with living streamside. Some of the problems they talked about is just keeping the stream flowing, clear, free of trash, removing, feeling, they had to get some of those weeds out of there either on the side of the stream or in the stream. The difficulties of maintaining a lawn in, wet areas, just accessing the stream, getting across it, and also managing drainage, keeping the water out of the basement, keeping the pond from getting too gunked up, and also dealing with erosion. Those were topics or issues, problems that were discussed frequently by the 23 streamside landowners I spoke with in these urbanizing watersheds. Just some of the emotional aspects of the stories or what they shared with me. Across the board, at least with this group, again was a purposive sample. We chose these for a very specific reason, that they were in these critical areas representing this range of landowners. But with that group, there was definitely a strong sense of responsibility, the sense that I had to kind of keep things out of the stream, and also they wanted to, be a good neighbor and studious caretaker. A less common sense of our emotional aspect of these stories was that of isolation and powerlessness. I think the powerlessness was just a few landowners who were in the urban, older subdivisions who had experienced a lot of erosion and felt powerlessness in the sense that they wanted to do the right thing for the stream, but it was too expensive, and they were pretty much felt hamstrung, I guess, by having to deal with a lot of permits to do something. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the water law and policy section. But that sense of powerlessness was a more extreme example, a sense of a bit of isolation in terms of this. I heard from some of the streamside landowners with maybe less resources and maybe that hadn't contacted a conservation organization. We tried to interview about half that had contact with one and half that didn't. So the sense of isolation was, this is a lot of work to maintain this property, and I really don't have any help with that. In terms of desires, definitely, as Robyn had mentioned, having the streams, even if they were highly modified streams, provided aesthetic benefits for people. And so some of the desires included, of course, having an aesthetically pleasing area with lowering the maintenance and maintaining their property values. And if they had that sense of environmental ethic, which some people contributed to be part of the baby boom generation, they really wanted to be doing the right thing. Some of our agricultural landowners talked about just wanting to maintain this personal history of having the land in agriculture, not selling it off to developers, but they wanted that maintained. Let me quickly switch here to the next slide. So we asked specifically, has law and policy influenced any of your decisions on your property as a streamside landowner? And we also asked about specific decisions they made and asked what the influences were. So we really probed about this in two ways. about just a few residents either expressed that they were simply uncertain if any local, state, federal laws applied to them. They had put concrete to, prevent erosion or some other type of rock, and they weren't sure if there was any regulation related to that, or they wanted to upgrade a bridge and wasn't sure about that. Others, as I mentioned in some of those extreme examples, just a few landowners felt really restricted, that they'd sort of looked into addressing erosion, but there was just too many permits to deal with. Local government was definitely came up in the discussions, not in terms of a specific law that they as individual landowners had to apply to, but just that in cases where they had contacted them with help about erosion or flooding issues. And some were just pleased with the response that they got, especially with the Soil and Water Conservation Organization in terms of help. In some cases, they were frustrated with the lack of assistance. This came from folks who had not contacted the Soil and Water, but had simply felt like they were having to deal with the flooding and erosion with also having to pay stormwater fees and taxes. In a few cases, some people expressed that there was concerns about equity, that the municipality had helped one landowner or not another, or had made one landowner's issue worse by stabilizing one part of the stream bank. As far as state laws and regulations, those were mentioned as having direct influence on streamside landowner actions. People talked about having to install a certain type of septic system, stop dumping into the stream, and or have put a no-mow zone by an agricultural ditch during certain times of the year. Watershed organizations were mentioned under this concept of law and policy as playing a role in these urbanizing watersheds in terms of helping state government enforce stormwater regs by reporting violations of construction sites, so runoff that shouldn't be occurring that was. Just a couple of our early ideas on this area of law and policy and how it's influencing streamside landowners is maybe to continue to clarify what laws and or regulations do apply to streamside landowners in a way that they feel like they can be comply with them effectively. And I guess just the one, this other idea came up of, we realize that we are on our own in some ways with having to deal with erosion and flooding, but it would be good to know what other landowners are doing, how they've dealt with these issues, how much money it's cost, and where they went for help. We also asked landowners, have you been influenced by non-regulatory efforts such as outreach and education? Clearly, again, local and state government were considered definitely responsible actors for maintaining stream health and also trusted sources for information. Several people mentioned that they thought that a state agency in natural resources was responsible for stream and watershed health. They weren't really sure what the name of that agency might be. They definitely thought they would trust information from their local government. NGOs such as higher ed and regional planning were mentioned as other trusted sources. The New Albany High School was mentioned as an influential community source that was for their environmental program and influencing how people thought about streams. In some cases, homeowner associations were mentioned as being good ways to get information out. As far as outreach, people were mentioned frequently that preferred sources were either mass media or one-on-one. Specifically, they mentioned getting information from the suburban news press for things like on streams, handouts that they'd gotten from the Soil and Water Conservation. If they had made contact, they had been able to use. Some of the rural residential said that they would trust information from magazines like Farm and Dairy, and specifically not necessarily that it had a green message, more that it had a message of how do I take care of my pond or stream with reduced chemical use. With the Natural Resource Conservation Service, we had two full-time farmers, and one of the full-time farmers mentioned that if that information addressed effective drainage, then that would be a way or a place that they would go for information on streams. The web was mentioned a lot for searches about information, that almost anything can be found there, but nobody mentioned any specific websites that they would go to or would think to go to for stream information. Clearly, one-on-one communication with experts is having an influence on the people that have made these contacts. So they've either we'll look at some of the decisions they're considering based on these contacts, but it's pretty clear that it's having an influence on how they think about maintaining their property. Also, we've had people who were either looking into putting in riparian buffers or had done so, or fencing to keep cattle out of stream that they'd seen at specific demonstrations or fairs. Someone actually mentioned Farm Science Review and some of the erosion control demos there. Just some early ideas, again, we have on this area of outreach is to maybe always consider partnering with local and state governments for reaching streamside landowners, because they're definitely looking to them for information on streams and stream quality. The next couple of slides, I'll just put up some quotes that I had that that exemplify some of the influences that are playing a role in people's decisions. This was a thought expressed by a full-time farmer, but not only them, but also a couple other residents, both in the rural, residential, and urban settings, where just the thought that streams, they have to be able to do their job, and water has to flow, and so, sediment has to come out after a certain number of years, so that can continue. Another influence or perspective that was from this was from an ag landowner who was looking to rent some ground out to be farmed, and they had actually been approached by the Soil and Water Conservation District to enroll that land, and then they'd actually decided or made that decision. And what's interesting about this particular woman was that this decision, in combination of the outreach effort and the fact that the recession hit and they couldn't sell the land to developers, for them, enrolling in CREP, they came to see the land as a liability. And this is just a look at how both economic influences and outreach kind of propelled this particular individual to enroll in a conservation program. And then last, just looking at a suburban landowner, this is someone who had actually been in contact with Soil and Water and had sort of gotten the message that in some ways not doing anything in terms of stepping away, getting away from the bank and allowing some vegetation to grow. He struggled with this message. On the one hand, he got it and thought wanted to do that, but on the other hand, it was hard to do sort of a less engineered thing and to allow some vegetation to grow on the stream. We haven't created any specific educational products based on this research. That's one thing that we want to do. But I did want to look around for some examples that seem to take these interests, some of the risks people see and benefits of streams, and incorporate it into their materials. The links to these materials will be on the website, but I actually thought that these were great in terms of, for this first one, the Virginia Department of Recreation and Conservation's communication campaign to promote BMPs with farmers. It really looks at a production and bottom line focus, and they've got several materials, everything from radio announcements to actual newsletters and brochures or fact sheet with this focus on some farmer and production interests. And then the next one was really aimed at more for suburban residents. It was really a lifestyle guide that Washington State has up on the web in terms of expresses the current condition in the watershed, tells them what regulations, it talks about erosion control from the landowner's point of view. Just ask questions that landowners ask, why is this happening? What can I do about it? And all that information is in one place. I'm going to turn it over to Deb now, and if anybody has questions, I see a couple of them are coming in. That's great. Please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll get those here at the end.
Okay. Thanks, Ann.
Sure.
Well, what we're basically doing in terms of the high school or the future streamside landowners, we took surveys with 15 high school students, and tried to find out what their gaps in the knowledge were, because we understand that those people are going to be the people who are managing and maintaining the streams in the future, and we need to have them have good information in order to do that. So we did have interviews with these people to find out what their knowledge gaps were, and as you can see on the slide, that one of their biggest problems was this misunderstanding of how streams are formed and the direction of the water movement. That was probably the most stunning knowledge gap that we discovered with these students. Again, their perception is that water is flowing from a larger stream or a larger river and actually forcing the tributaries to be formed, as opposed to being directed through the tributaries down and making the larger river. So that was a big issue. The second one that was of big concern, or a knowledge gap, was the lack of knowledge regarding the stream's shape and the influence on that stream health. Their concern was that their thought was that it was a good thing for streams to be straight. And again, many of these students live around agricultural areas that are being reduced, obviously, and turned into urban areas. But what they see are these channelized streams, and that they think that's normal, and that's the way it should be. So again, their lack of knowledge in terms of the benefits of sinuosity was lacking. Again, the roles of headwaters, wetlands, floodplains, it was really poorly understood. They have some very cursory information about the importance of headwaters. I think they get the idea that wetlands is a shallower area, but most often they felt that the wetlands were detrimental as opposed to a benefit to the system. And this idea of floodplains was clearly just off the radar in terms of what floodplains are and the benefit to the system. So again, those were very poorly understood, and as you can see below here, the response that we clearly got from a majority of the students was, I don't know. So again, their response to it was just very poorly understood. Another I don't know response from the students came from understanding what the watershed is. We simply asked them, could you explain to us what a watershed is, and what are the boundaries? How do we find boundaries in terms of a watershed? And again, the answer was, I don't know. So when we take a look at, here are some of the examples of the actual responses from a couple of these students. And as you can see, they have some idea that has to do with water and streams running, but they have no general understanding of what a watershed is, or how it operates, or the benefits, or even the size, or anything like that. So that is a huge gap in that particular aspect. Then we were able, from the interviews, to discern the top 10 misconceptions, and keep in mind there were probably a lot more than this, but these were the top 10 that seemed to be the most important misconceptions in terms of the students. And flow direction, as you can see at the top there, is the first big issue here, with 53% really not understanding which way the flow was going in a stream. They also had very little concept of elevation, that there is a gradient to the land, and that the water is moving from a high to a low perspective. So again, that was one of the major misconceptions. Water flow, again, Robyn alluded to this earlier, that their concern was that they felt that if the water was flowing very rapidly, and oftentimes their terminology indicated that it was a very fast flow, that was better for the system, again, because their biggest concern was that it was flushing out all the pollution and the debris that was in the stream. The substrate, they felt that the substrate should be rock or mud or soil, which, again, that is a true statement. But they felt that the rocks promoted a better flow. Now, when they were speaking of that, they were thinking of the rocks were actually somehow creating a situation or a condition that the water would flow more quickly. And, of course, they were largely concerned that it was very hard to walk on those rocks in the stream. Keep in mind, we're talking about basically 16-year-olds in these interviews. The next one was on stream flow or formation. Again, the tributaries form from the main stem. Sinuosity, they didn't think that the curves in the streams were important only from the perspective that it created a faster flow. The curves created a faster flow was their idea. And these places were also, these curves were conduits or collecting places for bacteria. They had a very big issue with bacteria in the water. From somewhere they've gotten the idea that there's pockets within the stream that collect large amounts of bacteria. From the watershed perspective, in terms of their knowledge or the misconception, it's just a collection of water, which again you can see. I guess you can, if you've been around 16-year-olds, you can get the idea. Yeah, I understand what they're talking about in terms of the collection of water, but that's a very limited understanding of watershed. They have had no understanding that watershed was connected in an area and actually moved through greater portions of land to the ocean or that kind of thing. That connectivity or that idea of that unit was very limited in terms of their knowledge. Wetlands, the students felt that this may be a source of poor quality because the water is too shallow and it cannot support life. Just the opposite, of course, of what happens in a wetland. It also introduces trash into the streams and robs the streams of nutrients. So that's a huge misperception in terms of their understanding of this specialized area. And then we have these other three that were, again, areas of misperception. So basically what we did with that information, we went to the Gahanna High School. We were working with Gahanna High School, and we contacted Fred Donaldson, who is the director of the science department there, and he was able to recruit 3 other teachers that wanted to work on this project, and we asked them if they would like to come to Cherry Valley Lodge and have a workshop so that we could think about these knowledge gaps that we had discovered and also how we could remediate these knowledge gaps. So basically what we did was meet for three to 4 days in late August, right before the school season started. And we talked about these knowledge gaps. We had several speakers come in to help these teachers with this issue. And basically the outcome of that workshop was that they took those knowledge gaps and they defined 5 essential questions that they were going to try to create lessons dealing with streams and watersheds around these 5 different questions. As you can see, the first one here is how does topography, elevation, and gravity influence the flow and direction of a stream? So they were able to create several lessons that were related to this question and actually infuse new information into their lessons to eliminate or remediate these misconceptions that the students had. Where are the niches and habitats and organisms found in streams and watersheds? Again, the students' understanding is very elementary in terms of what a niche is, a habitat, and what kind of organisms are found there. It's basically their response to these kinds of issues was basically what they had seen, and honestly, a lot of these students didn't spend a lot of time in the streams. Now, Gahanna has a special situation because they have the downtown area that has that meeting area around the stream, the community area around that. So that did help a lot in terms of some of the students' understanding. How do energy and nutrients flow into the watershed? How do human activities influence the stream? And where is connectivity apparent across the watershed? So the teachers developed a variety of lessons, infused those lessons into their already existing curriculum, and had fairly successful results. If we take a look, this is an example of a lesson, an infused lesson plan. This is on stream flow, but basically we have these set up on our website. These lessons include the knowledge gap topics there. We've also included into these lessons the various topics that are considered in that lesson. We've got these lessons connected to either to their local objectives or standards, and also to the state standards. And then you can scroll down into these lessons, and they give you a step-by-step procedure on how to deliver the message to the students. And then at the end, we have the teachers included their evaluations, and they also did a little statement on how they felt the lesson transferred to the students and how well it worked in the classroom. And then, of course, there's supplementary papers that were associated with each of these lessons that are included into these lesson plans. So we have several of those on the website. Here's some examples of the students remediating their misconceptions of the stream. We took the teachers took them out into the streams, and a lot of them did stream studies. They've done work with these. We had one teacher who was able to do a stream study and then connect with another teacher that was up in the Worcester area who was also doing a stream study. So they were having a dialogue between the students in terms of the things that they were collecting from the stream and the data, and sharing data that way. So that was a very good interaction between different systems. The other thing that I want to mention here is we also interviewed the parents of a lot of these students, and the parents had a similar misconceptions as the students. So some of the things that we thought were important that need to be addressed in terms of creating these lessons was to encourage this collaboration within the lesson with the parents. And the reason we want to do that would be to transfer information, not through the student to the parents, but also keep streams and stewardship as a priority in their thinking process. If a student comes home and has a lesson that has to incorporate a parent, then they're engaging in a dialogue that talks about streams, which may not happen on a daily basis or even a weekly basis on normal circumstances. We also think that these lessons need to have a community service component into it, where there is a collaboration or a communication across the generations within the community, and this is going to not only inform each other, the students and the citizens, but also keep an open communication with a discussion about streams and what they can do as collaborative efforts within the community to help the streams, or to disseminate information or inform people about about the streams and even the status or the conditions of the streams. So that's basically it where we're at with the future streamside landowner, is that we're trying to remediate the misconceptions and give them a sense of, I would say, a power that they too can have an impact on the streams even at this young age, and also to create a network with their parents and within the community to start thinking about these issues and implementing simple things within the community that can help support stewardship to the streams and the watershed. Okay, and with that, I'll give it back to Ann.
Yeah, I think we're going to unmute everybody here for the next 10 minutes or so, and well, Joe, I'll turn it over to you for the moderation.
Okay, well, you've got two ways to submit questions. One would be to use the chat box at the lower right-hand corner of your window there, and I've got one question to pose there. And the other one would be to raise your hand. And to do that, if you look at the list of participants, at the very bottom of that list, you should see the palm of a hand icon. And if you click on that, then that will tell me that you have a question. And then I think, Brian, if we do get someone raising their hand, then you can unmute them. You there, Brian?
Yeah, if someone raises their hand, I'll unmute them.
Okay. We did have one question. I think this goes back to your presentation, Ann, and you mentioned, I think it was the landowner of agricultural land who had said that it was going to be expensive to do a less engineered practice on the stream side, and Robert was wondering what would make it more difficult to do a less engineered approach.
Yeah, I think that was a suburban landowner actually, and yeah, so he had gotten the message. It's less is more, and there's sometimes the best thing to do is just set back away from the stream and sort of let the vegetation and create a corridor of some sort. But his concern in terms of why that was difficult, I think it was just that it's hard not to want to mow down to the stream in terms of that's kind of what people do there. So this was a new idea. So I think it was difficult to think that, one, that was going to work, even though he deliberated. Yeah, I think it is probably a good idea if enough people do it, but it's really hard to overcome that kind of norm of neatness for these suburban areas.
Okay. Well, I have a question, and I'll just leave it open to anyone who wants to address it, but it came up for me when Deb was presenting and talking about maybe what she termed misconceptions about stream health, and in working a lot with farmers related to stream health and water quality, for them, a healthy stream is a straight stream, and it's one that drains quickly. And so I guess it doesn't surprise me that some people who live in areas where there is a lot of agricultural drainage would perceive that a healthy stream is one that's straight and that drains well. So I'm wondering, as an educator, how would you suggest that someone handle that notion that what they might be hearing from the ag community, or from maybe it's their father or their uncle or their aunt, that a good stream is a stream that drains quickly, and straighter streams drain quicker than curvy streams, and to some extent they're right. For achieving their goals as farmers, that might be the best stream. So as an educator, how do you deal with that, the fact that depending on what your personal objectives are, what's an effective or a good stream might be different, say, an ecologist's perspective.
Yeah, Joe, I think, this is Deb Hersha, and I was thinking, I think that in an educational setting, I think the educator needs to address the fact that the streams are used for many different services. Different people have different uses for that stream, but from an ecological standpoint, the channelized stream may benefit the farmer or anybody who's using that kind of a stream for that need, but in terms of ecological perspective, it doesn't do much for the stream. So I would think that from an educational perspective, educators would need to show various perspectives on how the streams are used and what that use does, what impacts that use has on a stream from an ecological perspective. I don't think from an educator's perspective that we would need to have press an agenda as to, what is better. The fact is that these streams are used for different purposes, and because of those different purposes, they have specific impacts on the stream from an ecological impacts. And again, we need to understand those and be able to make decisions based on trade-offs. Are we going to take the risk of maybe degrading our streams because of channelization, getting water off the land as fast as possible? Is that a good trade-off? Are we going to do that? And those are decisions that those citizens need to make on their own. But from an educational perspective, we need to help them understand all those perspectives and also the impacts on the streams regarding those perspectives. That's how I think I would address that question.
Yeah, and this is Robyn. I was just going to add, I think I agree with Deb, but I think Joe brings up a good point, which is part of the purpose of this study, is to differentiate between how those beliefs are held differently across the population and where they might be coming from. So I would absolutely agree that it wouldn't be surprising to see that among a more rural or even specifically agricultural audience. But I think for a lot of Deb's students, these were suburban to urban sorts of residents. And Deb, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but you didn't have a huge rural or specifically agricultural component there. So I think their motivation and potentially that belief about kind of channelized streams being healthier because they're flowing faster may not be agricultural related. It might be for different reasons. And so in terms of communicating with those audiences, definitely I still agree with what Deb said, but maybe you go a step further, even think about what's motivating that belief. It may exist across the population, but it may exist for different reasons. And you would address that separately. And at this point, we don't have enough with the interviews to really differentiate kind of rural versus urban differences and the strength of that belief or the motivation behind it. But in our survey, we're hoping to be able to do that so we could draw that line a little clearer and think about how you might educate or communicate differently with those groups.
Okay, we're running close on time, but we did have two more questions come in. The first one was noting that there are a lot of misconceptions among students. What effort was made in the study to work directly with science teachers? Because obviously the teachers can reach a lot more students than if you folks go out and try to educate the students.
Well, we had, this is Deb Hersha again. We worked with 4 of the high school students in Gahanna High School where we're focusing our work with the high school students. And we had 4 of the teachers, and in that workshop we talked about the various topics that should be discussed and talked about things that should be discussed under those topics. And I've been in close connection with all 4 of these teachers for the last year and a half. So, and again, we're sharing and supporting or sending supporting materials back and forth to each other and helping the teachers to better understand the system so that they can transfer that information into lessons to the students. and they're working really hard this year in trying to incorporate the connection with the parent and also with community service type products from these lessons. It's very difficult for them to do that kind of thing. Of course, they've got their normal agenda to deal with, and they're trying to infuse all this information, but we've been working fairly tightly with those teachers to get that information to the students.
And we just teamed up, too, with the Teaching and Learning Collaborative here in Columbus, a nonprofit kind of STEM organization that works with school systems across the state. And so Kelly Shrewsbury there is now aware of this and potentially involved in some future work related to this. And so hopefully we're starting to get at least these lesson plans that have developed, the essential questions, some of those ideas out there more broadly across the state to other educators as well.
Okay. I think we're out of time, Ann.
Okay. Yeah, just real quick.
There was one other question Elaine Mobius put on the chat, and I think that Debbie Russell also had her hand up. So if you two, well, we've got Elaine's question. If Debbie, if you could send your question by chat, then we'll make sure that one of our presenters gets to it and gets you a response.
Yeah, and just real quick on Elaine's question about can these, Elaine, these were actually interview guides, not questionnaires, but yeah, they could be definitely used in other watersheds, and that's something we can post to the website. That's ohiowatersheds.osu.edu, USDA. That's got the research materials, some of the presentations we've done, so you can follow up there, also with the lesson plans Deb's talked about. Just real quick, our next webinar, we hope you can join us, will be on January 27th. We'll be looking at algal blooms and land use practices. So for now, feel free to send any chat questions. I'll be on here for probably another 10 minutes or so, and I can get those to the presenters. I want to thank everybody, and that concludes our Lunchtime NPS webinar series, and we'll be back and hope to see you on January 27th.